Hello and welcome to this Taxcast Extra from the Tax Justice Network. I'm Naomi Fowler. For our usual monthly podcast, you can find us on www.taxjustice.net/Taxcast, and we're on all the usual podcast platforms. Today I'm talking to Professor of Practice in International Political Economy, City, University of London, Richard Murphy, also of Tax Research UK. I'm also talking to John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network. We're going to talk about a subject that's been gaining ground since the financial crisis in 2008, modern monetary theory. It has rightly challenged austerity as being the wrong response to the crisis, and there's a lot of good theory there which we're going to talk about. But some of modern monetary theory seems to contradict tax justice arguments on the central importance of tax. So, hold on to your hats while we explore these issues. Understanding how money is created and why tax is so important can lead us all to a brighter, more sustainable future, more sustainable economy, and a Green New Deal. We're going to talk about modern monetary theory. We're going to talk about what it is, what it isn't, and how it relates to tax justice. We're going to start, first of all, by establishing what tax actually is. Many people write about this, that there are 4 R's of tax. It's not just about raising revenue. John?
Yeah, tax is a remarkably sophisticated issue. It's right at the heart of democracy. So, yes, tax has a role in raising revenue. That's disputable, but at local government level, tax is a key part of raising revenue for local government expenditure. The debate in Britain tends to be a little bit focused on, that's not relevant because we don't have such a big local government. But outside Britain, at local government level, tax is key. But more importantly, tax is also a key part of redistributing wealth and income. And we all know that in current capitalism, wealth and income has become wildly maldistributed, and therefore we need to intervene in that. On top of that, tax is used to reprice where market failures lead to, for example, mispricing of hydrocarbon products because the price doesn't reflect the damage caused, the pollution and so on. And finally, and this is very important as far as we're concerned in the tax justice community, tax helps to build those relationships between citizens and states. In other words, it's a key part of the representativeness of modern democracy. Now, others might want to add to that list. I'm sure Richard will.
Richard will, I think. Right, you've got a couple more R's for us to think about.
I have got some more R's to think about. One of those is actually, requires an explanation of what money is. And I think we need to talk just about that as well as about what tax is, because the two are actually intimately related. It's always been true that money has been almost universally created by governments. And governments have basically issued money to people to get them to do something for them. A long time ago, this was basically the government issuing a gold coin, which was itself pretty worthless. Gold is not intrinsically valuable. You can't do anything with it. To soldiers to induce them to go and risk their lives to fight in some foreign place, probably for no great purpose. But nonetheless, that's what they did. And the reason they did it was that the money could be used. Now, why could the money be used? Because the government insisted that its money was required for the payment of tax. Now, the idea then came about that, of course, tax paid for the war. Now, actually, the war was paid for by issuing the money to the soldier. The soldier then spent the money on whatever they wanted, and the person who received it had an income, and as a result, the government asked for tax back. Now, that's quite an important cycle, because first of all, it says that actually money and the issue of money comes before taxation, not taxation comes before the spending of the money. And so the cycle is different from that which we normally think of. But what it also says is it's the tax, or the demand for tax, which gives the money its value. So in practice, my next R of taxation is it ratifies the value of money. Money has a value because you have to pay tax in it. And you can't pay it with anything else. And because of that, therefore tax is fundamental to actually making sure the pound, the euro, the dollar, the yen, or whatever else you might have in your pocket is useful to you. The second thing that actually, therefore, tax does is actually reclaim the money that the government has spent. The difficulty is, and this is something which should be said right up front, governments could overspend. And if they overspend, the inevitable result would be inflation. Now, as an economist, I think inflation has some use, but modest inflation. And history has proved over time that rampant inflation is very definitely bad for societies and economies. So the tax is used to reclaim the money the government has spent. And actually effectively cancels it, by the way, but let's not get too worried about the technicalities. The point is, it controls inflation. So this is another use for money. So it reclaims, that's another R. If I can actually then suggest one final R, we're really pushing the boundaries here. That is that once we understand that the government creates money before it taxes, and then that ratifies the value of money, which is then reclaimed through the taxation system, the tax system takes on another whole role. Now, 4 of those roles are the ones that John has just described, redistribution and repricing, market failure and so on. But fundamentally, I put big overarching R over that, which is reorganizing the economy. And that is what economists call fiscal policy, using the way in which we run deficits and the way in which we give tax incentives to actually make sure that we stimulate economic activity, we drive to full employment, and we will promote the changes that a government wants in its society with regard to economic activity. So that's my last R. We might end up with 7 Rs, in fact, after all that lot, because revenue raising is a function for local governments and also governments who don't have their own currency, which of course is true of many countries in Europe. They don't have the freedom that a country like the UK has, which has its own currency and its own central bank. So they do use tax to raise revenue. Overall, it's a pretty complex story, but money and tax are intimately related in it.
Okay then, so help me out here. We've got 7 R's now. So we've got revenue, repricing, representation,
Redistribution,
very important, reorganisation,
ratifying the value of money, and reclaiming the money that's been spent into the economy by the government.
Reclaiming the money. Okay, so what we should talk about now then is how money is created and what is money.
Look, how is money created? It's really simple. And actually, at this point, if I'm standing in front of an audience, I often take out a UK note and draw the audience's attention to the fact that it has printed on it, I promise to pay the bearer on demand. And that's all you need to understand about money. Money is a promise. It's a promise to pay. And what the government does when it creates money and prints that on it, it doesn't actually say, I'll give you gold, because you can't change your printed note into gold. That's not been possible for many a long year. It doesn't offer you anything else. What it does promise you is it will accept this money in payment of your tax. So when it gives you the money, for whatever reason, you might be on benefits, they might be buying a service from you, they could be doing all sorts of things. They're paying a salary if you're a teacher or a civil servant or anybody else. They're giving you money and they're promising that if you spend that money, you and all the other recipients can pay your tax in it. And it's that promise which literally gives money its value. Now, the other people who can create money are banks. So there's 2 sources of money. Governments can create money, of course, via their central bank, and also private banks can create money. But remember, private banks only exist under government licence. You can't just go and set up your own bank. That's not possible, and for very good reason, because the government wants to have control of the money supply. The way in which a bank creates money, out of thin air, literally no money needs to be in existence before they make new money. A customer comes in and says, I want to borrow some money. Let's call it €10,000. I want to borrow €10,000 to buy a car. And the bank looks at the person and says, yes, we think you should probably be able to repay that. So the customer is allowed to promise to pay, that phrase again, €10,000 back to the bank. And the bank in exchange promises to pay €10,000 to whoever the customer wants it paid to buy the car. They have made mutual promises. And it's that mutual promise that creates the money. That's it. That's how you make money. And when you repay the loan, the promise is fulfilled and the money disappears, which is an incredibly important point to make. It goes. But of course, so long as the economy is making new loans all the time, or if the government is spending all the time, there's enough money to go around. If the economy doesn't create new loans, or if the government stops spending, which is of course what governments try to do in austerity, there's not enough money to go around and you get a recession. It's as simple as that.
Right, I want to ask about austerity a bit later and why it might not be necessary. So just to check something, when the government creates money, they often call it printing money, when they had quantitative easing, when they sort of injected money into the banks and all the rest of it. They put some noughts on a screen.
They can simply issue money to the banks, and the banks will absorb that. And the vast majority of money that comes into circulation from the government doesn't come out in the form of notes and coins, the type of thing that we have in our pockets and wallets. It comes in the form of bonds issued which are bought up by banks and major finance houses.
So it's electronic. Most of this money is electronic, let's be clear. It's a balance on a computer ledger.
It's right to say that about 3% of money in circulation in Britain at the moment comes in the form of coins and notes. It's a very small proportion of the overall.
You're right.
So 97% of the money that's in circulation in the UK economy, and I suspect in most economies in the advanced world, comes in digital format.
And all that digital format does, of course, is record the promise to pay. Remember, if you've got what you call money in the bank, there is no pile of notes and coins there. All that your bank balance records is the bank's promise to pay you whatever you think you've got in the bank. Now, you could go in and ask them for that in notes and coins, and if you really insisted, they'd find it for you. Although they might ask some questions as to why you need it. But the reality is, of course, the vast majority of money that goes out of bank accounts simply moves electronically as well. All of this is just tapping keys on computer keyboards. That's how money is made.
OK, let's talk about modern monetary theory now then. Now that we've established what money is and what tax is, what is modern monetary theory and how does it relate to these two things?
To a very large degree, we've already discussed what modern monetary theory is. Because modern monetary theory does say governments create money. And governments create money using their central banks, and they own the central bank, but there is nonetheless, in effect, a promise to pay between the government and the central bank to create this mechanism where it can put the money out into circulation, and then that money gets value because the government will tax to recover the money, so it ratifies the value and reclaims it. That, in essence, is what modern monetary theory says.
And I think there's a large amount of agreement across the piece, so to speak, that is what modern monetary theory says. What we in the tax justice community have been discussing with many of the modern monetary theorists is, where does tax fit into this? There are some people who would argue and who have challenged us, saying actually tax has no part, it plays no role, it doesn't fit in to modern monetary theory, because if the government can simply create money and pay for whatever it wishes to,
why does it need tax?
Why does it need tax? And it's kind of ignoring, and that's why we kind of laid it on rather thick to begin with, ignoring the 7 R's that we've laid out between us. Because we say tax is so much more sophisticated than just a case of raising revenue. And of course, there are lots of governments which can issue money, and in times of a weak economy can issue a great deal of money. There's no need for austerity. But then that ignores the role of tax in redistribution of wealth, repricing of market failures, building those representative democracies, engaging citizens, reorganizing the economy, as Richard explained. So far from being incompatible, we in the tax justice community argue that tax is absolutely inseparable from modern monetary theory.
I'd actually even go further than that, John, because I've been nodding my head in furious agreement with you whilst you were saying all that. But let's go a little further. If tax is fundamental to valuing money, if tax is fundamental to reclaiming the money from the economy that the government's spending, because we don't want excessive inflation, which is why we're going to tax, and because we actually don't want to have the government spend more money into the economy than the economy can use. Can I be clear? This is the other constraint. There are two fundamental constraints in modern monetary theory. The constraint, which most of economics thinks is real, is the ability of the government to borrow. That is not true in modern monetary theory because the government can create its own money. And we've proved that by quantitative easing. In the UK, roughly 1/4 of UK government debt is now owned by the government. I can tell you, owing yourself money is not a problem. If I owed my mortgage to myself, I would really not have a difficulty in paying it at the end of each month, because it would be like it coming out of my left pocket and going into my right pocket. That is absolutely irrelevant. So the government can create money. But the key issue here is that if we do need tax to make the economy work, then we must have a very good tax system. Not only must it support all those R's, redistribution, repricing and so on, and the incentives given to industry must be the right ones, but actually it must be socially fair as well. Because if we don't actually collect money from everybody who owes, we're creating inequalities and injustices. And this is the core tax justice argument anyway. If we permit tax evasion, if we permit tax avoidance, if we let tax havens undermine our tax system, create inequalities, because some will be paying what they do owe and some won't be, and that is a form of massive social injustice in itself. It also creates massive injustice between businesses too, because some will be competing fairly and some will be competing unfairly. So modern monetary theory as an economic theory requires us to have tax justice or it doesn't work, and I believe that's fundamental. I'm afraid to say there have been those in the past who have said tax does not matter in a modern monetary theory system. I disagree fundamentally. That indifference just shows a lack of understanding, in my opinion, and we have to talk about tax justice as being the flip side of this modern monetary theory. Without each other, they make no sense.
I just want to ask you something to clear something up as well. Not all governments have the same ability to create money because they don't necessarily have a stable system or a strong currency or a strong economy to back it up for all kinds of other reasons, right? So you can't just say that all governments and all economies can create their own money.
Well, up to a point. I mean, what's quite clear is the US dollar, because of the enormous strength of the US economy, the strength of the dollar, they can almost print money endlessly.
Right.
Successive Republican governments, they talk the language of austerity, but they pump the money out there all the time in practice. I think it's much harder for a government from the global south with a weaker currency, because they're likely to come under more pressure. But at the same time, they probably have a great deal of underutilised resource, particularly in the labour market, which can be used more productively. So the inflationary pressures are very often exaggerated. And just looking at the UK, for example, notionally the UK labour market is close to full employment, and that's a disputable idea. But actually there's a huge amount of slack in the labour market. Productivity is very weak. There's a lot of underutilised part-time workers who are in some cases only working a few hours a week, counted as fully employed. There's a huge amount of slack in the economy, and therefore the inflationary pressures, in my opinion, are massively exaggerated.
Let me build on both those ideas, because I think you're absolutely right, John. When we look at countries which do not have strong currencies, which are not readily convertible, there is obviously a problem compared to a country like the UK, where all our national debt is basically issued in sterling, and the USA, where all the national debt is issued in dollars. I mean, there's a tiny part of UK national debt which is, I think, in Chinese renminbi, but irrelevant. So we can't default on our national debt, because if somebody comes along and says, please, will you pay me, the Bank of England can always create the money to pay. At will, it can just create whatever's necessary. So to say that we have a foreign exchange problem is untrue, because we can always pay. We might have a foreign exchange rate problem, but that will be down to our UK productivity compared to other countries. That's different. That's not true in a country where they can't basically borrow in their own currency. And so I looked at the case of Lebanon recently. I was in Lebanon. Most of their borrowing is in dollars, US dollars. There is obviously Lebanese currency, but frankly, you don't need any when you're in Lebanon because you can spend everywhere in US dollars. The two circulate freely alongside each other. And so there obviously is a problem for the Lebanese government. They have lost control of their economy because they have lost control of their currency. Now, this is a major problem in many countries where there's a parallel currency. It's also a problem when actually the government doesn't spend enough in an economy, curiously. This is actually an argument for bigger government. Because when tax doesn't really matter very much as a proportion of your income, which it won't in some countries, you can't actually influence behaviour using it. And the whole idea of modern monetary theory, of money getting a value through the need to pay tax in it, is pretty irrelevant because most people aren't paying tax. This is an issue in many developing countries. We shouldn't ignore that because it undermines the value of money and the control that a government has. Big issue we need to worry about. John then mentioned another issue, which is about this constraint of the capacity to spend in the economy. Now, this is really important, and a key element in modern monetary theory is that instead of kowtowing to the financial markets, and if they say, we don't want to lend you, we won't spend money as a government, the government should instead look at the real economy of people. And are people at work? Now, this is, again, fundamental. And the argument is that people should be given the chance to work. Now, modern monetary theorists call this a job guarantee, a promise of a job at a minimum wage for everybody who wants one. I have some problems with that because I think one needs more choice. I think there are other options, for example, a universal basic income, and some of modern monetary theory don't buy that. I think that's a policy option which follows from modern monetary theory, not a core element of it. The point about modern monetary theory says it liberates the government to decide to deliver the well-being for its own people, so long as the capacity to create that well-being exists within its own economy. And as John says, even in the UK, where at present we supposedly have 96% of people who want to work being at work, I don't believe that that's true. I think we could induce more people into work if we actually offered them the chances and the opportunities. And I think there are vast numbers of people who would like to work on better pay for longer hours in work that they want to do and frankly make a living wage rather than a very low wage. And we could do all of that and not create inflation. And that's the point about modern monetary theory. Again, the argument is you won't create inflation so long as you keep putting resources to work. Now, I would add another dimension to this because I'm going to put another hat of mine on, which is the Green New Deal, which is, of course, all about building a sustainable economy. Actually, putting people to work is about using a non-renewable resource. Once you have not used somebody's labour, it's not available to use ever again. It's gone. So actually, it's really, really environmentally sound to put people to work if they want to work, because not only do they benefit socially and economically, and I value both those things, it's actually about using the right resource, which is this non-renewable human labour resource, rather than substituting, quite probably, carbon-burning activity instead.
Green New Deal, John, how does that relate to all the things we've been talking about? Because it's that investment, isn't it? And governments can either do what they did with the banks after the financial crisis, where they created all this money and handed it all over to the banks, or they can invest it in something that makes more sense, it seems to me.
Well, if we put the Green New Deal in the context 10 years ago of a massive financial crisis, and then the imposition of austerity, the alternative, and there were so many alternatives to austerity. Austerity was just the wrong thing to do at just the wrong time. The Green New Deal would have been a superb investment, a superb opportunity to create the type of jobs, which is absolutely right about the non-renewableness, if that's the right term, of the labour that's been lost as a result of this, but also the need to urgently reduce the fossil fuel carbon content of our economy, particularly in the United States and in Europe. We should be leading here. It's a massive lost opportunity. The idea that it cannot be financed because the money isn't there, of course, it's so easily refuted. Governments could have chosen to make that investment. They should have chosen to make that investment at that time because there was a great deal of slack capacity within the markets. And what was particularly irritating was the argument which you hear all the time from politicians: the money isn't there. Sorry, it's your job to create that money, to make that investment happen. And it was a colossal failure, a failure as much as anything else because of the failure to understand how economies actually work.
In 2010, I wrote a paper called Green Quantitative Easing. And this came out of the Green New Deal idea, which I had been involved in writing since 2007. And the idea of Green QE was in contrast to quantitative easing, which was then being promoted by the UK government and others as a way of fundamentally reflating the banks. The money from quantitative easing, £435 billion in the UK so far, of government-created funding, was to basically increase asset prices. It deliberately created inflation in housing prices and in share prices and in commodity prices, none of which actually produce any well-being for ordinary people, and indeed might do the exact opposite. And it worked. There has been enormous inflation in those prices in the decade since, at cost to the rest of us, and stagnation in the real economy. The argument of green quantitative easing was that money should have gone into building renewable energy sources, making every building into a power station by adding solar panels, by insulating it, by double glazing, and vast numbers of buildings are thermally hopelessly inefficient, and in the process would create long-term jobs for people who would be engaged in this activity in every single constituency of the country, whereas I'm afraid to say most government policies are very biased to very particular locations and very particular industries. So the intention was to create a long-term stable investment programme which would pay a return. Now, I believe that would have worked a lot better. And this does embrace the idea of modern monetary theory, because what it says is that this would have been funded by a green investment bank, which we've been so enlightened in the UK that we actually had a green investment bank, which has now been sold off and privatised. So we'll now need to create a different one with a different name. The point is, it would have been the fundraisers. Now, if people had wanted to buy bonds issued by a green investment bank for savings purposes, and it would have been entirely possible to encourage that through the tax system, then that would have been great. But if there wasn't a market for those bonds, then the government could have bought them instead. Yes. And that would have been entirely consistent with modern monetary theory. And it would have been effectively the government injecting money into the economy to create the full employment and the sustainable economy we need. Now, this is, in my terms, turning economic theory and tax justice into living practice that impacts upon the reality of people's lives. This is where all the stuff that we've talked about for years and years and years comes together in one sort of big idea which actually transforms our futures. And I believe it could do that. And that's why this is important.
You've been listening to a Taxcast Extra. I've been talking to Richard Murphy and John Christensen. For our monthly podcast, you can find us on www.taxjustice.net/Taxcast. Thanks for listening.